Morning.
And for most of you, I don't need to introduce myself, but just in case, I'm Gerry Glancy, and welcome today. Before we get started, a few announcements. Next week's class will be a reprise, a makeup class on track laying by Leighton. I got his first name correct this time. Leighton Moreland. So if you missed that class, you can catch it again next week. The following week, it is a change on the program, and it will be Jacob. I forget now. I got a blank on his. Jacob Lofgren. He's going to talk about trees, not so much tree making per se, but what kind of trees grow, especially in Colorado. The varieties of pine trees, why you find them, where you find them, what altitudes, what side of the hill, et cetera, et cetera. It's really a very interesting program. I've heard it before, and it'll really make your scenery a lot more realistic. So I'd encourage you to attend that. And then coming up in November, in addition to our basic classes, which will be on scenery, will be two classes by Roger Frank. And the first will be DCC systems, and the second will be on installing decoders. One of our more astute students caught a typo in the program, and so I'll point that out to you on the 17th of November. I did not put the little asterisk indicating that Roger Frank's class is a 1 o'clock class, because there'll be an 11 o'clock class on Sunday. So just make note of that. All right, well, let's get started with today's topic. And I hope, if nothing else, you have a little fun with this, because this may be considered a bit of a sidebar in railroad history, and yet it's one that I find very fascinating. And that, having said that, I also hope too that you take away some modeling ideas and some operational ideas. So you could read the title there, and let's get started here. And this is how we're going to cover our topic. We do have to deal with the history of narrow gauge in this, not just in this country, but Canada as well. I kind of left out Mexico, not deliberately, it was just too much information, but there was lots of fascinating dual gauge that took place in Mexico as well. And we're going to take some selected examples of how standard gauge and narrow gauge interfaced, and then that, of course, segues into modeling opportunities and operational enhancements. Just to get the kids off the street when we start using abbreviations, so SG standard gauge, NG narrow gauge, DG is dual gauge. When I talk about the real railroads, the prototype, we'll talk about switches, but when we switch to model railroading, we refer to them as turnouts. We're going to talk about the railroad, what they called a draw. We're going to call it a transition track in the model railroad world, and I'll explain what that's all about. So I used to say whenever standard gauge met narrow gauge, there was always some element of dual gauge. That's not strictly true. I'll point out the singular example I've come across where that didn't hold true. This, incidentally, was sort of my main reference by George Hilton. It was published in the 1990s by Stanford University, and it has virtually everything you ever want to know about narrow gauge, at least in the United States. The first 6 chapters are eminently readable, which I can't say every railroad book can claim that accolade, but I found it so. And the remaining chapters deal with all 460 some odd narrow gauge railroads that ever existed in the United States. So if you ever wanted to learn about the York and Peach Bottom, or the Dismal Swamp Railroad, you can find it in this book. And if you just think I was kidding you about those names, those are railroads that actually existed at one time. So we go back in history to this 15-year interval called the heyday of narrow gauge, because in that interval they threw down nearly 12,000 miles of narrow gauge track in this country. It was really quite an enthusiastic endeavor. And the reason that it was so popular at that time is a number of credible engineers said, look, it's smaller, so it's cheaper to build a narrower right of way. You can go around a mountain instead of tunneling through the mountain. The operating costs are going to be less expensive, and therefore it should be economically viable. The problem was this was all based on a priori assumptions. Nobody had ever really tried it before, and it didn't really pan out quite as expected. So over the subsequent 50, 60 years, most of those narrow gauge operations either were converted to standard gauge or simply just went away. They went away for a variety of reasons, but one of the major reasons that narrow gauge really didn't pan out in the long term is that there weren't that many narrow gauge railroads that really were entities in and of themselves. They were always connections to a standard gauge railroad. Therefore, you had to take whatever you were carrying on your narrow gauge line and transship it, i.e. place it in the standard gauge conveyance. That operation is called breaking bulk. And we'll find out some varieties of breaking bulk in a little while. But before we get there, let's talk about how the railroads then dealt standard gauge versus narrow gauge when they came together. And of course, the first thing that you have to have is dual gauge track, 3-rail track. This is an example of Salida, probably the late 50s, and you can certainly appreciate the dual gauge track here. For those that are familiar with this site, off to your right, of course, would be standard gauge to Tennessee Pass. Off to your left would be narrow gauge on up to Poncha Junction, Marshall Pass, and on to Montrose. And of course, also down to Alamosa. So dual gauge track, and we have dual gauge switches, and what the Denver and Rio Grande referred to as two frogs and a toad when they were dealing with dual gauge switch. Now, this is what is meant by a draw. Occasionally that third rail, the narrow gauge rail between the standard gauge rails, has to go from one side to the other, maybe coming into a station, or in an obligatory fashion if you have a reverse loop, or especially a Y, somewhere in that Y you've got to have a draw. It's got to move from one side to the other. If you don't believe me, sit down sometime with a red pencil and a black pencil, draw a dual gauge Y, and pardon the pun there, you'll find that at some point you got to move the rail from one side to the other. That becomes important operationally later on, as you'll see. So if you've got to move around both standard gauge and narrow gauge cars, then your locomotives need to have dual couplers. This is an example on the front of an East Broadtop locomotive, and here's a Denver and Rio Grande example on a C-48 consolidation. This was used largely in Salida for switching. Now, what occurred on a standard gauge locomotive typically occurred also in narrow gauge, and also this interface that we're talking about really existed well into the 60s here in Colorado, and as we'll see later on, even as late as 1988 in Canada. So into the diesel era, and here on the cab end of this Baldwin V660 are dual gauge couplers. It's kind of interesting if we look at the other end of the same locomotive, number 73, we only see a single coupler, but it looks like the draft gearbox here is kind of set askew. Well, let's look at this a little more closely. End on, and we see that this coupler now that was up and in the center for standard gauge is now moved down to one side to couple onto a narrow gauge car. And this whole mechanism, I think it was home built and was operated by air. If you look at the air hose here, it's connected to the mechanism that operates this coupler on number 73, and they had a couple of other easels similarly equipped. So what occurs for standard gauge also occurs for narrow gauge. Here's a narrow gauge locomotive with the centered narrow gauge coupler, but notice the coupler pockets up and out to accommodate standard gauge switching should the occasion arise. And if you didn't have a locomotive equipped with dual couplers, then you could use this idler car. Denver Rio Grande took these tender bodies. These are standard gauge tender bodies, and again put on a 3-pocket coupler, and the coupler, of course, could move as necessary to couple whatever train or rather car was needed. And the result of that is you could actually run a mixed train. And by mixed, I don't mean just passenger or freight, but rather narrow gauge and standard gauge cars in the same consist. That typically occurred in the Denver and Rio Grande between Alamosa and Antonito, or actually a little further north from Hooper down through Alamosa to Antonito. So here we see a narrow gauge locomotive, idler car, standard gauge boxcar, idler car, and then a string of narrow gauge boxcars. Actually, those look like reefers. Now here's the opposite situation. A standard gauge consolidation, idler car, narrow gauge boxcar, another idler car, and then standard gauge stock cars. And typically from between Alamosa and Antonito, a train would head out in the morning, a consist with standard gauge cars to be dropped off, usually at La Jara, for agricultural purposes, and the rest of the train would go on to Chama and to Durango. So double-headed narrow gauge, idler, standard gauge cars, an idler right there, and then all these tank cars, of course, are going to Chama or on further down to Farmington, where there was an active oil field. Now the Canadian National had a little bit different take. You can see the standard gauge boxcar mixed in between these narrow gauge ones, and we'll explain how that occurred a little later in the program here. And same for the East Broad Top in Pennsylvania. This is a standard gauge mill gondola, but narrow gauge hopper cars on their way to be connected with the Pennsylvania Railroad. So let's see how the railroad dealt then with this incompatibility problem, this breaking bulk from narrow gauge to standard gauge. And this is how I've kind of broken it down: grunt and groan, gravity, sophisticated gravity, mechanical advantage, industry selection, and truck transfer. Here's the penultimate grunt and groan. You see C&S here, and I suspect this is Denver, probably around the 20s. So Colorado and Southern would have gone up to Leadville, would have loaded into the narrow gauge hoppers here, or gondolas, some kind of ore, which is being transferred to the standard gauge cars, shovelful by shovelful. Labor was cheap in those eras, and even one stone at a time. Or in the case of the East Broad Top, from the standard gauge to the narrow gauge, one sack at a time. Very labor intensive. At least the the Carson and Colorado, which went through the Owens Valley, kind of a little south of Carson City, and it ended up almost a little bit shy of Keebler, a little shy of Death Valley. A lot of bulk commodities, they took advantage of gravity. So this is a narrow gauge Carson and Colorado, and their gondola cars went up to this trestle. Now this trestle, the vents only existed on the outside. There was a slot down the middle here for the standard gauge, and this is what it looked like. So the standard gauge Southern Pacific hopper cars would go underneath the trestle, and then over the top, by gravity, they would drop the load. This is probably a load of talc on the Carson in Colorado. And I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4 workers. Well, let's see, yes, two supervisors. That would be about the right ratio there. Needless to say, this water car serves as an idler car. You don't want the weight of the locomotive on this trestle. Speaking of the Carson in Colorado, this is the only one that I've come across that did not have any dual gauge when it interfaced narrow gauge with standard gauge, which is way down there. You can see the little gantry there where they did transfer commodities between the two gauges. And the Carson in Colorado, just like here in the Denver and Rio Grande, existed and operated well into the diesel era. And these really delightful little GE 70 tonners were narrow gauge diesel locomotives. Well, at least the Denver and Rio Grande had a more sophisticated take on gravity. This is the barrel transfer, which you know existed in Salida, transferring mostly limestone from Monarch, but also coal from Crested Butte. And so the narrow gauge high side gonds would go into the barrel. They would then be tipped up, and their load would fall into a standard gauge drop bottom gondola. And this mechanism was quite unique. The car would actually slide to kind of a, how should I say, a buttress board here, and then these 4 clamps connected to cables would then go up over, and this was a counterweight to these cables, preventing the car from falling out of the barrel transfer. And this is what it looked like in action. So there it is rotating. You can see the load of limestone pouring out of the high side gone. Notice as it gets further and further tipped, then these counterweights ascend. And that was the barrel transfer that existed until the late 50s, when, of course, they standard gauged their line up to the Monarch Quarry.
I thought that was
No, actually, that was built in 1927. And this is taking advantage of overhead gantry to transfer some harvested lumber, cut lumber from narrow gauge to standard gauge. That was in Alamosa. And sometimes you can place your industry such that the narrow gauge comes in and then the standard gauge will pick up the completed product. Both of these are East Broadtop, and this was a brick plant. So you can see the dual gauge track. The narrow gauge cars would come in with the raw commodity. They'd make the bricks. Standard gauge cars would pick them up and take them on to wherever. A big function in the East Broadtop was coal mining, and so on narrow gauge hoppers, the coal would come into this processing plant. You wanted to size the coal depending on its use. And what I didn't realize too, you want to wash it because it's still got a lot of dirt in it. And so you had to wash it, and then that would then be transferred to standard gauge Pennsylvania hopper cars and off to the East Coast for the houses and the industries and gosh, whatever, back in that era. So what about truck transfer? Somebody had the idea of saying, well, look, why mess with the car at all? Let's just switch out the trucks. And they took advantage of the fact that the truck really just sits passively on the car. This is the kingpin, and it just inserts down through the bolster. But there isn't anything that attaches it to the car. And this is true to this very day. So a guy named Ramsey, and this is back to the turn of the century, said, well, we'll just dig a little trench, erect these little bogey wheels on either side to pick up the car as it descends into the trench, and the trucks will just passively drop off, and then we kind of haul them out and haul in the other gauge, whatever it might be, set up and lower the car back down as we take it out of the trench, and we're off and running. And it sort of caught on, at least it did with the Utah Northern. This is up in Pocatello, and you can see the pit for the truck transfer here in the 3-rail track. Incidentally, this Utah Northern, its southern terminus was Salt Lake City, and the Denver and Rio Grande at that time in history connected with the Utah Northern. So you could get on at Denver, and by narrow gauge route, you could actually end up in Butte, Montana. That was 1,000 miles virtually on a narrow gauge road that you could do at that time. Well, there was a little problem with this. When you put a standard gauge boxcar on a narrow gauge truck and you overload the boxcar, and the track was poorly laid, as most track was in narrow gauge, and a wind comes along, this is what happens. They often blew off. So it didn't gain a lot of favoring, except with a couple of railroads, and I'll show you those here right now. The East Broad type.
At the instigation of Railroad President C.D. Jones, the EBT devised a better method. Using an overhead transfer crane, crews could lift standard gauge cars off their own trucks to be replaced by specially modified narrow gauge trucks. Here we see a Pennsylvania Railroad gondola being retrucked from narrow to standard gauge. By this means, the bigger cars could be handled almost anywhere on the EBT. The legacy of Robert Sievert's improvements once again paid the railroad dividends.
In that little shed above the crane, I've got a guy playing a Hammond organ, and it really helped the employees in their morale. I'm kidding, of course. They did like their Hammond organ.
This northbound train has a pair of standard gauge cars in its consist.
Standard gauge, and then those are the East Broad top hopper cars. Blackstone used those hopper cars as a model, and I think you can still get them, at least certainly through eBay. So that was East Broad top's take on truck transfer. Let's see what the Canadian National did, in particular in Newfoundland. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Newfoundland. Newfoundland is kind of fun. I thought it was just a little island up there. It's a big island. And again, about 1890, it's a very hilly place. And rather than cut a bunch of roads, they said, well, we'll just build a railroad, a narrow gauge railroad. It's actually a 3-foot 6-inch gauge, but it's nonetheless narrow gauge. So they did that, and it was the mainstay of getting around the island. And in fact, this represents about 900 miles in total of narrow gauge railroad in Newfoundland that existed, in fact, till 1988. It got a real big boost during World War II, and it's carried through. In fact, I just noticed this last night looking again at these slides. It says USAF, that's U.S. Air Force, over in the corner here, and we've got an Air Force base here in conjunction with Canada. Anyhow, back to the ranch. So people coming from the mainland would come into Port Bosque. They would get on the narrow gauge train wanting to go to St. John's, the capital. So, you know, at several hundred miles, it took a full day to do that. The best restaurant on the island was the dining car on the railroad. And so they'd get on, have dinner, and then go to sleep, and then wake up the next morning. And so as a result of that, you know, these big car ferries would come in, and this extended again into the diesel era. That's a standard gauge locomotive. This is a narrow gauge diesel. It's sort of a General Motors product, not quite, but they would have these mixed trains. So this is narrow gauge locomotive, standard gauge boxcar, and then narrow gauge passenger cars. So let's see how they did their truck transfer. They did it in this building, And this is what it looks like, standard gauge boxcar with a narrow gauge truck on it.
In an effort to improve efficiency, Canadian National has introduced an innovative system known as truck-to-truck transfer. Loaded boxcars from the mainland cross the Cabot Strait in rail ferries, and on arrival at Port aux Basques, they undergo a transformation. Specially constructed hydraulic jacks lift the cars off the rails. The wheel assemblies, known as trucks, are removed, and narrow gauge trucks are substituted. The car can then travel on the narrow gauge lines, eliminating the costly and time-consuming process of transshipment. While this is an improvement, there are still drawbacks.
And the drawback was that this is a 100-ton boxcar, carrying capacity. The truck, the narrow gauge truck, is only rated for 55 tons. So they could only fill the boxcar half full. But nonetheless, it was still somewhat more efficient than emptying out the boxcar. And so this was a typical consist on the Newfoundland clear up until 1988. So 3 locomotives, standard gauge.
547 miles of steep grades, sharp curves, and very little straight and level. That, in a nutshell, is the best description of the main railway line across Newfoundland.
So I guess we have to call that a mixed train. Okay, well, from the Atlantic, let's go clear to the Pacific, and that's why this title, From Sea to Shining Sea. And here we are in Sausalito. And again, we're looking at the early 1900s here, dual gauge track, and some car ferries here, and we're going to learn about the Lagunitas here in just a minute. And as most of you realize from Sausalito, the destination for the car ferries, not only the freight cars, but the passenger cars on it, and the passenger cars was San Francisco. It was a ferry building, and many of the railroads there operated their own ferry. And from Sausalito and Tiburon was the Northwestern Pacific Railroad that initially was narrow gauge. They operated the Sausalito for many, many years. And this is the Lagunitas, this sort of little ugly duckling here, a stern-wheeler car ferry, and its claim to fame is that it carried narrow gauge cars. In fact, it could carry, what's it say there, 10 of them at a speed of 8 knots. And so it would go from Sausalito over to San Francisco, landing on the Embarcadero. And so this is a picture early on of the Embarcadero, and you can see the dual gauge track there. I've been unable to uncover any pictures of dual coupler locomotives or either cars, but we certainly know that the narrow gauge cars came in to San Francisco for probably at least up till 1917. And the dual gauge track was still in use up to 1927. This picture is somewhat prophetic in another respect. If you look at the date here, May 11th, 1906. So anybody suggest?
You're going to shake us up,
Huh? So I'm going to suggest 18 April 1906, and that was the San Francisco earthquake. So only barely 3 weeks difference. If you look carefully in the background here, these are buildings that have crumbled down and they are still smoking from the fire. So along about that time, the state of California, there's kind of mass chaos on the Embarcadero. It was very unorganized. They said, hey, let's put this act together. They established the State Belt Railroad. It existed clear into the 90s. These are the familiar wharves that you see. It had about 60 miles of track. These great little 060 switchers for many years. There's an example of the dual gauge track that still existed even into the late 30s there. And so that again is another example of how we could use dual gauge to our advantage in a marine situation. All right, well, let's take a look at how then we can put this to use on our own model railroads. And fortunately, we still have available to us 3-rail or dual gauge track. The reason I show a Dremel here is that I would advise you to be a little careful in cutting this with the rail cutters, especially on this side of the track. It tends to twist it a little bit. You can pop the rail out of the ties, and they pop out, of course, on the side of the rail you want to use on your lab. So I would suggest you use a Dremel tool to cut the track instead. Shinohara, of course, has gone out of business, but these turnouts will still be available, hopefully on eBay. They come, of course, in right and left, but also you have to be aware that they come in a difference as to what side of the turnout the narrow gauge or 3rd rail is on. So you have to kind of keep track of that, because you want to avoid using transition tracks as much as you can in your layouts. I think all of us are now going to learn how to make our own turnouts. These are dual gauge turnouts from jigs, rather, from fast tracks. I haven't done this personally, but I have friends who have. They've become really quite adept at it. This is an example of the Lockheed Martin layout on the campus or the recreational area out there. These are handmade dual gauge turnouts that really work very, very nicely. Gerry Myers put most of those together. Sometimes you don't actually need a full dual gauge turnout. This is 3-rail or dual gauge extending in the diverging route here, but the straight route is just strictly narrow gauge. So what I've done here is take just a narrow gauge turnout, extended the ties, and then taken just a single rail, kind of spiked it, glued it down here, put in a guardrail, and so that's made a part dual gauge turnout out of a single gauge turnout. Here's our transition track. Again, it comes in direction, depending on what side you want to go to transfer your narrow gauge operation. And this is why it's a no-no to run a mixed train on a Y, because that Y will have a transition track in it. And if you think about it, the couplers then, once you shift sides, will not align themselves. So you need to avoid, or at least not go down the side of the Y that has a transition track. All right, this, when you go into a turntable, you'll typically go as 4-rail configuration, so you keep your narrow gauge centered. Is that still in focus for you folks back there? Okay. All right, so what I've done here is I've taken the Shinohara transition track. I've kind of carefully loosened the rail here, and you can move it down to have it rest against the tie plates of the standard gauge. You cut away this guardrail, cut this rail about there, insert another rail, the 4th rail, connected to this rail. Again, rest it against the tie plate. And if you do that, you come out with a perfect 3-foot gauge here, all right? And then the only final thing you have to do, it's kind of hard to see here, is a little electrical connection from the outside rail to the inside rail there with a little phosphor bronze wire that I've soldered there. So that's how you get into a turntable. This is an example. There's your transition track going into 4-rail, and this is a standard Walther's, I think it's a 90-foot turntable, and I've just simply with CA glued the 2 other rails on the turntable, and that way it will function in a dual capacity. Either cars are available as a kit. This Rio Grande Models has been around for a gazillion years, and they're still in business as far as I know. They make a little kit, and it will then make into a nice little idler car for you. When we talk about couplers, you can go to Heyday, and when they came out with these trucks, they called them scale trucks or three-quarter trucks. They are smaller than the standard coupler. And the only difference between the numbers here is twofold. Number one, they're either rust or they're black, or if they're for standard gauge, they have a longer glad hand. Whereas if they're for narrow gauge, they have a shorter glad hand. You're probably going to cut that off anyhow. It doesn't really matter. You can use any of them. So we have to convert our locomotives to accommodate dual couplers.
Yeah.
And here's how you do it on a steam locomotive on the tender.
It is.
This is the spacing from the center line. You're going to drill and tap for the coupler, aught 80, and then you're going to snug the narrow gauge coupler underneath the standard gauge. Let's take a look at what it looks like. This is the tender of a Broadway Limited consolidation. Brought it home, took off the coupler, the Heyday coupler that came with it. And don't you just love taking a nearly $300 locomotive, bring it home, and then you take a Dremel tool to it. But that's what I did here to cut the slot in the draft gearbox to accommodate the narrow gauge couplers. Those are drilled and tapped there, aught 80. And you put everything back together, and that's pretty much what it looks like. Using then that 713 as your standard gauge coupler, and then the one just below it as the narrow gauge. And whatever you do for standard gauge, you want to do for narrow gauge, so it can couple onto a standard gauge piece of rolling stock. This is the pilot from a Blackstone K27. You can buy these pilots separately, by the way. So this is the switcher pilot, taken off the cut levers and drilled with the Dremel these little troughs to get the right coupler height, and then drilled and tapped 80, 3.2 spacing from the center line, and that's the end result with two couplers here that will accommodate standard gauge, irrespective of what side the narrow gauge happens to be on. Now diesels, it gets a lot more difficult because the size of the power truck, you really don't have a lot of room. This is a little hard to explain. It's brass flat stock and a square bar, and I've cut kind of a little plate here, soldered it to the square bar, made a little construct of styrene here in an attempt with three couplers mounted here to insert it into the front, the cab end of the equivalent, the model equivalent of that VO 660, number 73. It works fine, but it tends to stick out unprototypically. So that's a work in progress. You can get a coupler that has a shallower draft gear box here. That's the Micro Trains N-Scale 1015. It will sort of couple up to this Heyday coupler, but it doesn't uncouple very well. So that's not quite a solution, just in case you happen to think of it. So that's the coupler solution to operating dual gauge trains. Let's see what operational things we can come up with all this sort of stuff. This is a friend of mine who did construct a barrel transfer out of styrene. I'm not sure how it worked, but it looked pretty neat. So this is a standard gauge consolidation, getting the Shibano narrow gauge passenger train in position here in Salida with their Art Deco depot. And here's our K27 switching the standard gauge car. And a mixed train, dual-headed K27. idler car, three standard gauge cars, idler, and the remainder are narrow gauge cars. So it makes it a little more fun to run a train of that configuration. Let's see what we can do about that truck transfer. Can we duplicate this in the model environment? This overhead gantry isn't quite tall enough. I had it for another purpose. But this is how I came up with easily switching trucks on a model car. This is AccuCraft. They're nice little kits. They, in large measure, duplicate the era that we're talking about. So this is the floor of the AccuCraft kit. This is 5/32 brass tubing. I've cut it in little pieces, about 3/4 of an inch long, and glued it with CA just to the inside of the floor, making sure it's nice and plumb, nice and straight up. The reason I selected that tubing is that a number 5 machine screw that's 5/8 of an inch long will easily slide in this tubing without a lot of slop, without a lot of play, but it slides easily. So I screw that then up through the bolster of the truck. This means that either a standard gauge or a narrow gauge truck will slide easily into the car. The only accommodation I had to make in deference to narrow gauge is I had to grind away just the edge of the draft gearbox here on the coupler to permit adequate rotation of the truck. But if you get the right size gantry, you can lift the car up, and the standard gauge truck should drop away, and you can run a narrow gauge truck underneath. If you don't have that, you can get out the 050 and lift the car up, drop the one truck away, and easily insert the exchange truck. It's quick and simple without interrupting the flow of your operation. And so you can come up with a consist that looks very similar to these brought up with standard gauge boxcars and narrow gauge hoppers. Here's the Canadian National equivalent in Newfoundland. Remember, they did it in a building. And here's the car number 577062. And here it comes, equipped with narrow gauge trucks, having been exchanged in that building. And you notice the same car number. So we managed to accomplish our truck transfer in that building. Of course, it is a little bit of sleight of hand there, le jeu de bande. It's two cars with the same number, so we just leave them the sorry about that. All right, well, let's finish up here with a little bit of marine operations, something that I'm heading for now that I've got an unfinished basement and about ready to embark on my new layout. There's some plans available for the Lagunitas. That's on my to-build list. Here's a guy who did build a foreshortened example of that. It's really a neat-looking model. And Walters, as you know, has lots of stuff out for marine operations: the terminal and the car float, and the car float apron. So you can duplicate marine operations with the piers and the warehouses, and even ship your California wholesale potatoes. I'm not sure I've ever had an potato, but at any rate, it's something special, I'm sure. If you want to do additional reading, this is my sources here, and most of these were really pretty readable books. And then just finishing up, kind of just for fun, other little things that I came across in this search that were narrow gauge. There was a gas electric on the East Broad Top that was narrow gauge. And you mentioned earlier about trailer on flat cars. Believe it or not, one of the very earliest examples of this in the mid-30s was on the East Tennessee and Western North Carolina narrow gauge railroad. That's the Tweetsy Railroad, that's what it's called. And these were specially modified flat cars for the trailers. And finally, I just love to show this particular slide. It may not project really well with the overhead light, but this is the California Zephyr, you know, the penultimate streamlined train in most people's minds, headed by Denver and Rio Grande PAs in an early paint scheme. This is coming north of Boulder, and here we see adjacent to it is a 3-rail track. Now, admittedly, this was not a railroad operation, it was traction, something I left out of this track, but in Denver here and going up to Boulder and elsewhere, was a lot of traction, even coal mining out to Layden. And yeah, there were 2 different gauges of traction. And so they had their own sort of brand, if you will, of dual gauge operations. So this is kind of emblematic of, I think, from where we've come, and hopefully we'll never forget this legacy and we'll carry it forward. And so with that, I thank you very much for your kind attention.